En mi mal inglés, you are a donkey, Mr. Danger. You are a donkey.
That line, delivered by Venezuela's late leader Hugo Chavez as a jab at George W. Bush during the Iraq War era, wasn't just a meme before memes. It was a warning. Don't bring your wars to my region. Don't try it here. Fast forward to late 2025, the US hasn't launched a classic ground invasion of Venezuela, but what's happening now looks like a modern playbook. Military pressure at sea, airspace warnings, financial strangulation, and a narrative framed around terrorism and drugs. And the big question is simple. If this is just about narcotics, why does it look like a geopolitical showdown? Here's the surface story. Washington says it's targeting drug trafficking networks tied to Venezuela, especially after a series of U.S. strikes on boats near Venezuelan waters that have continued for months. Reuters tracking and mapping shows dozens of strikes since September 2025, with reported fatalities in the high double digits. At the same time, the U.S. has escalated politically. The U.S. government announced a reward of up to $50 million for information leading to the arrest and/or conviction of Nicolas Maduro. Trump publicly declared Venezuelan airspace should be considered closed, a statement that raised alarms across aviation and diplomacy. And in mid-December 2025, Trump announced a total and complete blockade targeting sanctioned oil tankers traveling to and from Venezuela. So yes, drugs are on the label, but labels are not always the product. Let's be fair, the U.S. does have a long history of using military assets for counter-narcotics operations, but there's a credibility problem here. Multiple analyses using UN-linked data and trafficking route estimates indicate that the Venezuela-linked maritime corridor accounts for a single-digit share of documented cocaine flows northward, often cited around 8% in some route breakdowns, while much larger volumes move through other corridors. And when we talk about the U.S. overdose crisis, the dominant killer isn't classic cocaine narratives. U.S. public health agencies repeatedly identify synthetic opioids, especially illicit fentanyl, as a primary driver of overdose deaths. That doesn't mean Venezuela has no role in criminal flows. It means this. If the stated mission is stop the poison, the scale of military buildup and the political endgame being hinted at look disproportionate. So what else is underneath the surface? Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves. That fact alone guarantees it's never just another country in Washington's strategic imagination. But there's a more technical point many people miss. Not all crude is interchangeable. Historically, parts of the U.S. refining system, especially along the Gulf Coast, were configured to process heavier grades of crude. Venezuela's oil has long mattered in that ecosystem. Now zoom in on 2025. The U.S. pressure campaign isn't only sanctions on paper, it's physical disruption, like tanker seizures, and now an announced blockade concept aimed at sanctioned flows, with analysts warning it could choke exports and spike economic and migration pressure. And there's also a strategic asset narrative hovering in the background. Who ultimately controls key Venezuela-linked downstream assets and revenue streams as financial and legal pressure mounts? Oil is money. Oil is leverage. Oil is also timing, because the next layer is even bigger. If you want the bigger than Venezuela explanation, start here. A major share of Venezuelan oil exports has been going to China, and that's central to why U.S. moves are framed as both economic and security policy. For Washington, this isn't only about barrels, it's about who shapes the rules, which financial rails trade runs on, who insures the tankers, whose ports and logistics chains dominate, and which great power gets the political influence that follows energy dependence. In other words, Venezuela is a chessboard square, but the match is US-China. And if you're thinking, isn't Latin America traditionally the U.S. backyard? Yes, and that takes us to the oldest doctrine in the room. The U.S. has repeatedly treated the Western Hemisphere as a special strategic zone, an idea rooted historically in the Monroe Doctrine, later evolving into a broader pattern of interventionism. That historical reflex matters because it helps explain why U.S. leaders react sharply to the perception of rival powers gaining strategic depth close to U.S. waters. So, when Venezuela deepens ties with U.S. rivals, U.S. policymakers often interpret it not as normal diplomacy, but as a direct strategic encroachment. And that's why the playbook tends to look the same. 1. Delegitimize the government. 2. Tighten economic pressure. 3. Create a legal or political justification for force, and hold the threat of regime change over the table. Which brings us to the current escalation mechanics. By late 2025, reporting describes a sharp increase in U.S. military posture around Venezuela, alongside repeated strikes on suspected trafficking boats and growing legal controversy over the conduct of those strikes. On the political side, the White House has framed Venezuela in terror terms, while Trump's public statements have included extreme warnings like treating Venezuelan airspace as effectively closed, and the administration has paired this with a new, highly confrontational tanker interdiction strategy. This is coercion by layers. Kinetic pressure, strikes at sea; legal pressure, terror framing and rewards; economic pressure, oil interdiction; and psychological pressure, airspace and we can strike messaging. So what happens next? Let's talk scenario logic, not predictions. Scenario A, deal under duress, most stable outcome. Maduro stays but makes concessions, oil channels, security cooperation, reduced strategic intimacy with U.S. rivals. This lets Washington claim victory without a major war. Scenario B, managed transition. Maduro exits under pressure, a successor government emerges that Washington can work with. This is the cleanest regime change outcome, but it's hard to control. Scenario C, limited strikes on land targets. A short, sharp escalation designed to frighten elites and fracture the security apparatus without committing to an invasion. Scenario D, ground operation. Highest risk. A full invasion is costly, complex, and politically dangerous. Even U.S. reporting and analysis around current force posture commonly emphasizes that a large-scale invasion would require far more sustained commitment than what's visible in typical deterrence deployments. Scenario E, chaos spiral. This is the nightmare. The government weakens, but nothing replaces it cleanly, triggering instability and migration shocks across the region. The key variable across all scenarios is not only what Washington wants, it's what Venezuela's internal power centers, military, security, economic elites, will do under maximum pressure. So when you hear this is about drugs, keep the iceberg in mind. The visible tip is counter-narcotics, but underneath, oil leverage, China competition, regional doctrine, and domestic political incentives, all converging on one country at one moment. And that's why Venezuela keeps reappearing in U.S. strategy, not because it's the biggest piece on the board, but because it's a square where multiple games overlap. And thanks for watching. Feel free to subscribe and share this video. See you until next one.